As we prepare for this next conversation, we're going to be talking about building wealth and directing capital to communities that are most impacted by these conversations that we're talking about. We're going to be bringing back Trisha Chakrabarti as our session moderator. Our panelists include Nicole Anad, Deputy Director at Inclusive Action for the City out of Los Angeles, Mariela Cedeño, Chair of the EFOD's Collaborative Community Investment Committee and co-founder of Manzanita Capital Collective, and Lenwood Long, Sr., President and CEO of the African American Alliance for CDFI CEOs. And of course, coming again is Cameron Smith, co-founder and executive director of Communities in Partnership.
I'm so excited to be here with these incredible panelists, amazing leaders in capital access and wealth building and in directing investment to communities of color. And just to kind of set the stage a little bit, so as the EFOD Collaborative was doing some of our primary research back when we were putting together our brown paper in 2019, we talked to over 45 different EFOD organizations around the country. And over again, one of the central questions of this panel kept coming up around access to capital and specifically how to work with CDFIs. So what we're going to be talking about today is what are CDFIs doing right in this country with their great assets and the incredible power and promise of their work, and what is not going so right, and what is not working as well as it needs to, and what needs to change. And importantly, as activists and community members, what do we need to do next? So, you already heard their names and their titles, but maybe by way of introduction, I'll do kind of a first question. So can you, from your perspective and the work that you're doing, tell us how your work centers strategies for wealth building in communities of color? And maybe we can just go down the line. I'll start with you, Cameron.
I have to start off by acknowledging another badass sister crew member here. Right quick, she came in. Our city council representative, Deidreana Freeman. Can you please raise your hand, Deidreana? She's instrumental in a lot of the work that we do. She represents our district and District 1, so thank you. So part of the strategy that we incorporate in wealth building strategies is while we're simultaneously feeding people, we're creating systems that actually work its way out of us needing to feed people. And so, like I said earlier, we have actually the food co-op that Mama V and Brother Clarence and Ernest and Aaliyah and all of us helped coordinate and found, to the Black Farmers Network that Jory has really stabilized and solidified and grown, to a rural to urban food system creation mechanism that we have to supply our own food and what we need for our people, to the Culinary Femme Collective, of which a lot of the food-based organizations, Peary, So Good Pupusas is a founding member, is to see you right over here, is a part of, and helping them to elevate their own wealth building strategies as femme and women identifying food business owners, but their wealth building strategies, they are dedicated to not have them predicated on the oppressive financial business practices that are so inherently deeply embedded in the food system, to our Thriving Communities Fund, which Cecilia, Indulge Catering, Period, and a lot of other food-based businesses have been recipients each of a $10,000 unrestricted grant to help them scale up their businesses during COVID, and Indulge specifically in some other businesses like Peary, and also Gail Jennings right over here with King's Peppers actually were targeting value-added food components so that they can actually have just ongoing revenue generating streams to come into their businesses. And so that doesn't cut down when we have situations like pandemics. The face-to-face interaction is what killed, or the lack thereof is what killed a lot of Black and brown businesses. And so they wanted to have a passive income strategy that didn't predicate on so much face-to-face interaction, helping them stabilize. So these are the types of individual initiatives that CIP and others have implemented.
Hi, everybody. Mariela Cedeño here. Yeah, I'll try to share a little bit about the EFOD fund. Like Tricia mentioned, this was one of the big pieces that came out of the EFOD collaborative and leadership in that space. And obviously part of the question that we were trying to solve for is access. But another big piece that came out of that was actually process. And part of that process was power. And so when we were talking about the EFOD fund, we were trying to really be diligent about thinking about, yes, partially is like, how do we find resources that make sense and are right fitted to EFOD collaborative and the wider space, but also how do we change the process itself so it doesn't feel like we're recreating the mechanisms that have felt like not just extracted from us, disinvested from us, but also made us feel powerless in the relationships with finances, period. So a lot of the work and some of the structures, infrastructure that we set up for the EFOD fund that I'll share will be in that space of not just shifting capital, but also shifting power.
Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Nicole Anand, here on behalf of an organization called Inclusive Action for the City. So we're an economic justice organization based in Los Angeles, and we serve the entire county of Los Angeles, Black and brown underinvested communities, micro entrepreneurs. Many people know us for our work with street vendors, inclusive of street food vendors. And that is a large group that we are serving. We are a CDFI, but I think it's worth noting that we also do research-informed advocacy policy work, which I'll be talking about in a little bit in relation to our CDFI work. So happy to be here.
Thank you so much. My name is Linwood Long, and delighted to be here. I always like to give context to why I'm doing anything, but in this era, I always and have consistently over the past several months used the words of Secretary Janet Yellen to make a point. She said at the Martin Luther King breakfast that from Reconstruction to Jim Crow to the present day, our economy has never worked fairly for Black America, or really for any America. That was January 22. In 1958, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that the inseparable twin of racial injustice is economic injustice. 64 years later, and what are we talking about now? Equity, inclusion, and access. It says that we still have a lot of work to do. So with that context, Linwood Long, President and CEO of the African American Alliance of CDFI CEOs, which is a network of 60 Black-led CDFIs across this nation, focusing upon access to capital, really working around three principles: building capacity, building bridges, and building power. And this power is not institutional power, but it's the ability to influence legislation and program that had the unintended consequence of inequities. So within that context, I am delighted to be here and share a few thoughts about what we're doing right and what we can do better.
Thanks, y'all. I want to touch on one of the things that both Linwood, you and Nicole mentioned about advocacy and power building. You know, for some of us, it might not be a clear connection between the work of capital access and the work of advocacy, or even how that works to build power. Can you talk a little bit about how you see that connection?
Again, Douglas said, power concede nothing without a demand, which means that it takes collective voices to begin to have impact in making changes. In the early 20, actually it was March 20, at the onset of the pandemic, there was a paper published by three organizations, the African American Alliance of CDFI CEOs, Prosperity Now, and Expanding Black Business Credit. It talks about the fierce urgency of now. Fierce urgency of now address this twin problem of lack of access to capital of black businesses, and also the lack of capital for black, the inequities of black-led CDFIs. We think that paper, that white paper, that call to action, stimulate much discussion with black and brown organizations that literally spoke to the heart of Congress. Not that Congress had an epiphany and say it's the right thing to engage CDFIs and PPP, but I think it resonates the fact that we lifted the conscious level of awareness to say that CDFIs lived on Main Street, worked on Main Street, and knew Main Street, and thus that inclusion. Without raising that voice, that policy shift would have never been made.
So at Inclusive Action, kind of talk about two interventions into systems we're trying to change. On the one side, there is the CDFI, and that's more of the surviving, right? We're administering loans, microloans, and pairing that with technical assistance or business coaching. And that really gets our clients through the day-to-day, the week-to-week, and so on. But it was very clear to us very early on that was about survival. Instead of surviving, what about thriving, right? And so we do have a large component of our work that is focused on policy change. And it's actually a really exciting time because as of yesterday, we hit a huge milestone, which I'll just share. Shout out to our policy team. So at Inclusive Action, just to give you a taste of what we mean by policy change and what we've been doing, a few years ago, we helped to decriminalize and legalize street vending in Los Angeles. What happened coming out of that was that street vendors, non-food street vendors were getting their permits, but food street vendors, after doing some research, we found out that only 2% of food street vendors were able to get their permits. The reason for that is the California Retail Food Code. And so we went on to develop a bill, introduce it into legislation, and right now it's going through the legislative cycle. And as of yesterday, it went and passed through the Senate Health Committee. So huge hurdle and really exciting. So, ideally this goes through the whole process, the bill passes, and it will make the lives of street food vendors a lot easier. They will be able to live without fear, and just continue to be incredibly hardworking and contributing to our local economies. So it is the surviving and it is the thriving, the policy and advocacy with the microloans and technical assistance.
So I'm curious about kind of extending this conversation around power building and how the creation of funding structures and financing structures can be used as tools for building power. From the practitioner perspective, how do you see that connection?
So maybe I'll just share a quick, maybe not quick story. But, as I mentioned, both Tricia and I's prior role was at an organization in Oakland, California called Mandela Partners. I like to share the story of this fund that was created in the state because I think it's a good example of lack of power. And then I'll share a little bit about our fund and how we hope to envision building power. But there was a fund created in the state in 2016, and it was specifically meant to incentivize food retail in low-income communities of color. It was a almost $300 million fund. It had a mix of public and private dollars. It was administered by local-ish CDFI. And because the fund was about retail and food, and our organization worked in retail and food, we were starting to recommend projects, right? We recommended a Black-owned co-op, a Latinx-owned restaurant, a Filipino-owned added value producer, and nobody was making it through, like not even past the first interview, like the intake kind of questionnaire piece of things. And so we went to the folks that were managing the fund and said, like, why is this? And there was a lot of reasons that I'll try to keep the story short why. So we said, okay, fine. Mandela, as an organization, will apply for a small amount just to kind of, as a proof of concept that this can be done differently. And so we applied to a $100,000 loan. Mind you, at the time Mandela had grown, we had a balance sheet, we had like grants in line. We were pretty strong, like financially positioned. And when all said was done, it took us 12 months to underwrite a loan, a $100,000 loan to Mandela. Just for context, of that $100,000, if we met our commitments around like low-income communities of color or whatever that kind of criteria was, half of it would be forgiven. Or sorry, 25% of it be forgiven. And in order to get the loan, we had to put a half like loan loss guarantee. So of $100,000, we're really talking about $75,000 that this fund thought was at risk, of which we had to put $50,000. So we spent a year underwriting 25 grand. And in that year of underwriting 25 grand, they send their underwriters to our office about 6 times. And they weren't even California-based underwriters, they were based in DC. So I'm assuming they spent 25 grand just on like staff time and travel, right? Another thing I'll share about that story as well is that we were on, I have privilege, I speak English, I'm educated by, the system that folks like feel gives you some power in this. And I was like on Google on calls with them. They were like, what about this ratio? What about this? What about that? And I was Googling as we were talking to them, and I was like, yeah, we're good on that. Like, we'll send you some things. And then like Googling like template for this, like equation for this. And so, like that process for me, even as like an intermediate organization, I individually felt so powerless in it, right? In addition to kind of just how ridiculous it felt that there was a fund that was built to serve like my folks, my community, and that we had no access into it at all, right? And there was a lot of reasons for that. One, the money that came into that fund made all the decisions around how that fund was going to be underwritten and why they considered risk, right? So that meant that like the private capital, like JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, whatever money they took in, that system was just going straight into that fund. So even though it was meant for something different, it was the same system that was like making the decisions, right? And then there was just like the underwriting mechanism, which yes, it was like in a different fund with like a more beautiful mission, but it was still the same system that's kept money from our communities for 100, 200, 300 years, right? So I share that story as just grounding of the kinds of things that we as EFOD organizations are responding to and wanting to like build power around, right? So there is access, right? There's a fund that's been created specifically to support EFOD organizations, social enterprises, farmers that are working in food, land, and agriculture with a lens of equity and justice first, that they're being representative of communities of color, of like all these things that are important to our collaborative. But a lot of our work has been spent on who's making the decisions around capital, right? Like that power building, and what power does the borrower have or grantee have in this ecosystem? So the two kind of simple things I'll share about that. What that means for us is that we are really intentional about the money that comes in and having conversations primarily with philanthropy or like impact investors around what that means. And I'll just share right now that they're not easy and they're taking time, right? But we want to make sure that we have the kind of capital coming in to the fund that will allow us to do the kinds of things that we want to do going out. The other piece around power building is that folks who are representative of EFOD organizations are making decisions around capital allocation. So that means that like me, Cameron, like Jory, Lorena, like we're on the community investment committee looking at these projects and thinking like, do they reflect EFOD values? And from our experience running nonprofits, running social ventures, running farms, like, do we think that they'll work, right? Do we think that they'll sustain in the community? And then the last piece also that I'll share is that we are trying, and this is like still kind of like in an iteration space, to change the actual process, right? So when somebody comes to us and says like, we want money from the EFOD fund, that from the get-go we're trying to shift that power differential that happens when folks have money and we don't, and folks don't, right? Because we're now in this weird place where we have money to give out, right? And so we don't want to recreate that. And so for what that means for us is that a lot of our criteria or kind of the metrics that we're holding ourselves accountable is, does that person in that interaction feel like they're in relationship with us versus like in transaction with us? And so a lot of our self-questioning is like, how do we create an ecosystem where they're understanding what we're asking for, that they're telling us like what we're asking for doesn't make sense to them or it does, that we're having a shared understanding of the financials and the viability, and that they're they're the ones sharing that back with us, and that we actually ask them, like, how did we do? Like, did this go okay? Like, what would you have changed? So power for us means power like across those levels, across the money coming in, around who's making decisions around capital allocation, and that we both in relationship as folks who have funds and folks who are looking for funds feel like we're equal, and that's like a pretty basic piece of it.
So maybe you could talk about this from CIP's perspective too, around what does power mean when we're talking about creating alternative financial and funding systems, and how do we kind of shift that power differential?
So I'll share power over and then power with. Power over, for CIP, part of why we did join EFOD is because it's not just talking about food, but it's also other areas that have been dictated by the quote-unquote social determinants of health. So we have housing in our community, and for many of you who are from Durham, you know right now what we're going through right now is potentially the largest displacement, I'm repeating again, of working poor Black and brown folks right now. There's a lot of organizations that are kind of coalescing, trying to keep people in their housing. And I think oftentimes people that work in these institutions, because they themselves haven't been directly impacted or they themselves aren't currently being directly impacted, there's this disconnect of actually who's being impacted right now. And I'm just using the evictions right now that's going on in Durham. So my neighborhood, literally overnight, there's a house there one day and the next day it's gone. And then a week later, you see the structures of a McMansion being built. And my question is, where's my people? Where are they at? So we have 6 units of multifamily housing in our neighborhood, financed through a very large CDFI, one of the nation's leaders in CDFI, the father of CDFI. And I made a public statement, I've made it over and over and over again, that we will not evict one person from our housing during a pandemic or COVID. And now, that is the only reason why would give us justification to evict them is because of their lack or their inability to pay. Let me put it that way. CDFIs oftentimes go to the same funding resource folks that we go to in philanthropy, and they're getting billions of dollars that they don't have to pay back, period, on behalf of poor Black and brown people. So I was told as a leader that I have failed in the policies of housing, that we should not own housing anymore because we are not good at our job. Part of the job is to evict people because if they can't pay, you can't make money. I said I refuse to take part in a colonial system that has torn up my community and my people. I have to sleep at night. And one of the things that I have dedicated my life to, and I've said over and over again, that if I can't be who I say I am, then I'm out. I refuse to evict anyone for a lack of being able to pay. So by your definition of someone who's highly respected nationally and who is considered one of the founders of the CDFI movement, and you're telling me that I have failed because I will not sow into a system to displace poor Black and brown people, some of which who do not have documentation. You're telling me I failed at my job. Instead of taking some of that money you got off the backs of our people and helping me keep the housing and upgrade all the housing we have to a standard that I wouldn't mind laying my head in, any of you wouldn't mind laying your head in, and keeping those people there. We are at a rate of inequality in this nation that white folks are gonna have to give and ask for nothing in return, period. The amount of wealth that has been built off the backs of stolen labor and stolen land. I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional because we are dying. Our people don't have anything, nothing else to give. And money, during COVID, when we had lines, Veronica, Aaliyah, Jory can attest to this, lines of people all the way down, almost a mile down the street because they didn't have food in their house. And we were there. People about to close up shop, Black and brown folks. Cecilia can attest to this. We rallied around and got the money and made sure we were giving those businesses $10,000 each with no questions asked. I don't have 1% of the budget that this organization has. And you tell me I'm failing at my job. But you've gotten money off our backs for decades. Off for decades. We have to have a conversation about reparative processes.
Yeah.
Repair. Without any interest rates, some people, in EFOD, some people need to have that because we need to help them have a loan so they can build a credit profile. I'm not in la-la land thinking we're going to dismantle capitalism overnight. We're not. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is, especially if you say that you are about this work, you're about the movement, and you go and you get money on behalf of stolen land, stolen labor, and stolen people to actually quote unquote, give that power and those resources back, then be who you say you are and do it. Don't be like Bank of America. Don't be like Wells Fargo, because they don't have to go to Kellogg and get $20 million and not pay it back. And you got it off the blood of my people and Vivette's people, and Jesselyn's people, and Mary's people, and Aaliyah's people. We are not only the beautiful legacy, but also the lived legacy of power, privilege, and oppression at the same time. And I have been directly impacted, just like all these other people sitting up here on this stage with me. Don't act like that narrative isn't impacting my people today. So my question is, who actually is failing in this story? Who's failing? Because by the dictations of white male-centered supremacy, you have the nerve and gall to sit up there and tell me that I'm failing at a job because I won't displace my own people and the people who are descendants of First Nations people group who this land belongs to. But I'm a very good person. I'm a very good person. I'm very idealistic. And I just have no business, being in the housing business because I don't know how to generate. I'm not saying you can't make money. What I'm saying is you don't need to have that money predicated off the oppression and divestment of other people. Because then you're stealing. You're a thief, is what you are.
Yeah, she's speaking with a lot of emotions and actually real life, that if you go into the CDFI industry, you will find this dichotomy, or this disparity among black, brown, and white-led CDFIs. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons the African American Alliance of CDFI CEO came into existence was this recognition that was this huge racial wealth gap, not only in the black community, but on the balance sheets of black-led CDFIs. So part of our reason for coming into existence was to address the racial wealth gap, especially among black-led CDFIs. There was some numbers. I don't want to bore you with numbers, but I think it was 2014 where white-led CDFIs had like 13 million in assets, black-led like 5 million. Fast forward to 2017, white-led CDFI was like 35 million. Black-led CDFI is like 5.6 million. So what does that tell you? That gap still exists. And what bothers me is we do a whole lot of talking, and I think James Brown said it best. We talk loud saying nothing.
Thank you.
About the same old things. I gave you a statement that Janet Yellen made, and with all her power, with the State Small Business Credit Initiative Fund, which will invest billions of dollars, actually $10 billion if it's not cut, across the United States. How much of that money would go to black and brown communities? And yet still, we are not demanding states to be responsive to black and brown communities. And the fact that we can come together as they did to clap for Janet Yellen, but would not demand she use her authority and power to take actions to make sure black and brown communities, that states who do not have the heart to do the right thing, will make sure there's no trickle-down economics take place in those communities. And that's why the African American Alliance, this whole notion of building power, that's why we demanded and brought together black voices to say to Treasury, shame on you, you can do better. And so it is this collective actions that unless we do it and do it very intentional and very loud and stop applauding these nice statements that don't say nothing, don't mean anything, make us feel good, but don't put a dime in anybody's pocket in our community.
That's right.
I'm done.
Thank you, Linwood.
I love where this conversation is going because I feel like it's bringing us back to holding ourselves accountable. What does it mean to be Black and brown led CDFI? What does it mean to be fair in a CDFI? And going back to the panel this morning, what does it mean to have power with? And for me, that brings me back to what does it mean to have the people you serve be the decision makers, the decision makers in your work, right? In every aspect of a CDFI. So I think Tricia was probably about to ask me about inclusive action becoming a CDFI because we're a young CDFI, and I just want to share a little bit on that because that goes back to the people we serve and how they are the decision makers in everything that we do. So it was only about 2 years ago that we decided to become a CDFI, and lots of people think it was just a very simple decision that sure, you are lending and you want to become a CDFI. Actually, we had a California, we already had a lending license, right? And we were already lending. We already had our clients, the people we served. And the first time we asked them, because we asked them, brought them in fully into the decision making to say, should we become a CDFI? The first go around, it was an absolute no. About 90% of our the people we serve, our clients, were saying, this is scary. Will we have to report to credit bureaus? 90% of them are immigrants, right? Many of which undocumented. So are we gonna have to report to credit bureaus? It was a very particular time, it was 2020, it was Trump administration. There was a lot of stuff that I don't need to go over was going on. We did not become a CDFI at that point in time because the people we serve are the decision makers, and they said no. A year went by or so that was maybe 2019, a year or so went by, we continued to have those discussions, and some things started to change. We don't know exactly what changed, but definitely the sentiment around the advantages of us becoming a CDFI changed. And we think it was kind of twofold, that there was this feeling that building credit history was gonna help them help our communities get other types of assets, say buying a car, say, so on. So there was that, but also understanding that their credit was good. So almost understanding themselves and understanding that that was going to be fine. But there was this whole thing around sensitivity with data and data sharing, back to research and extractiveness and transparency around that. But eventually there was a comfort level that made sense, and it flipped. And as decision makers, they decided that we should become a CDFI. So that's kind of our story.
Yeah. Let me say this too, that sometimes CDFIs don't get it right, and but when they do get it right, and I really applaud the work of some of our Black-led CDFIs who are doing the right thing. For example, there are 3 initiatives that really I think represent a new wave. One is helping owners who rent become owners of that building. Building net assets, wealth creation. When you look at the New Markets Tax Credit Program, you look at Opportunity Zone, who benefit from that? Developers, right? And so we have a Black-led CDFIs that's really developing a bond program to help create the next wave of Black developers to go in and help develop those communities. And then we have another program whereby we have members making equity investments in the balance sheets. And so you have these black-led CDFIs underserved, serving the underserved, but being creative and trying to change this whole shift of wealth creation in this nation with the little bit of money they get. And we have to literally sing the Temptation song, I'm not too proud to beg, just to get a few dollars to make sure that these organizations continue to do the great work they are doing in black and brown communities.
I was going to add something, but I feel like you have a question, Tricia. So.
No, please. You're probably going to say what I'm going to ask anyways.
Yeah, I was just going to share, I think both of y'all kind of brought this up around, you know, just to be explicit that like this ecosystem of finance like thinks they're doing a great job, right? Like the kind of like white-led finance, like they think they're doing great, right? And speaking to you, Cameron, right? Like they're also getting a lot of money now to invest in communities of color. And they think they're doing a great job, right? I don't know what those qualifiers are for what that means. It usually just means that they're deploying money, not necessarily like, is that money causing harm? Like, is that money, like from the worst causing harm, from the best is it actually building wealth, right? So just wanted to like name that piece out loud, that a lot of what you're hearing is in response also to that larger ecosystem that thinks it's doing a great job. But the other thing I wanted to share also, and sorry, this is maybe a bit of a side note, but when we were starting to talk to folks in philanthropy and investment about this fund, I share that anchoring because the first pushback we got is like, why don't you just work with those folks? They're already doing a great job, right? And we got, especially from like institutional philanthropy, got huge pushback around that, right? From the folks that Cameron is talking about, right? They're like, look at that CDFI that's been around for however many years. They're doing a great job. Right? And so we had to, like, part of the battle of of building these kinds of funds, and it's not just EFOD specifically, it's lots of other innovative funds, is counteracting this narrative of folks that think that they're doing a great job, even though we like have data that says like, you know, a Latinx household, you know, 50 years ago had more wealth than they do now, you know, and a black household has less, right? So when we're talking about this disparity, you know, this racial wealth disparity of a white household having $140,000 in net assets, a Latinx household having $4,000, and a black household having $8,000. Like, people think they're doing a great job. And it's really, it's like, we're talking about innovation, but we're still fighting this narrative that exists. So just wanted to name that around like getting resources allocated for the EFOD fund. That was like kind of our first battle. The other battle is within that ecosystem, there's a practice, again, that believes it's doing a great job. They think like underwriting is getting to a point that's de-risking, right? And we've had to ask this question of de-risking who, right? Like, why do we keep de-risking people who are already rich, right? Like, our work as community leaders, as people of color, is to make sure we're de-risking for community. And that means something very different, right? And so a lot of our work has been shifting, like countering this idea of doing well already, and then starting to propose ways to do things differently. And it's hard because it's a practice that's cemented. And I just wanted to share kind of like on a more micro level, I live in the Bay Area in California. And I remember I was talking to somebody once, like, you know, I don't know, at a party, people who I normally don't hang out with. And they were telling me that they worked for the startup. The CEO was this like white kid who was like 25 years old, got $10 million and blew it all in 2 years, right? And then about an hour later, got $25 million to start a totally different thing, right? And I just kept thinking about the permission we give folks in a space, like white men specifically, to fail, right? And when they fail, we're like, you know what, but they're gonna do well because we have this like national consciousness that that's the community that's done well. Mind you, we have a fund, right? And like one business owner fails, like the entire world is like, that's it. We can't give money anymore to like Black or Latino folks because that one business failed, right? Yeah. And also to share that in that failure, there's a lot of learning, right? So part of what we're trying to figure out is like, how do we move away from that narrative around what success is, right? Like, how do we counteract this narrative that things are going well? And how do we give permission for folks to test and innovate, which might mean conventional failure, but for our communities means that we're de-risking. We're letting people try, get access to resources, and try again. So, you know, and I'm sharing this in context that like the EFOD fund is building something that it looks different and makes some people nervous. Like Cameron and I mean, I don't know, maybe you are, like we're not finance professionals.
You're way more than I
Yeah,
am.
okay, that's bad, right? I'm not. You know, but we know what our work looks like, right? And we've kept these things alive with very little resources. So when we're looking at EFOD organizations, at grantees, at lenders, we're looking at it from that lens of our contextual understanding of what it looks like and what it could look like, and giving folks the permission to be creative, to fail, to solve for those failures and innovate again. So sorry, just that's one piece of this. The other piece I wanted to share too is that not all of the things that we're doing are market-based. And I think with EFOD specifically and EFOD organizations, this was our big challenge in trying to access capital, right? Is that we didn't fit neatly into buckets, right? It was very linear. Like either you're a food bank, right? And like doing things in whatever, I have feelings about food banks, but doing food banky things, or you're a business, right? And EFOD organizations are holding this really interesting kind of gray area, which is that we have market-based strategies because we want to build wealth, but we're also holding things that, for like lack of a better word, should be social services, right? Or our movement building, or our organizing, or our power building, or whatever that looks like. And so part of our fund is thinking about what kind of capital serves those different things, right? So part of it is grants that's going out through the EFOD fund. Part of it is technical assistance, and not technical assistance that's useless, which is normally what we get, but technical assistance that makes sense to us and will actually support the success of the project on the ground. And then the third is capital, right? And I think to share to kind of come back to what Cameron said earlier is that like, we're not delusional that we're not working within a capitalist system, right? But we're also trying to create something that feels a little bit different than what exists now. And so we're exploring things of what does it mean to be non-extractive, right, in capital, which for us means we're moving towards 0% as much as possible, right? Like, and two, how do we change the narrative of who has the onus of paying back or like covering operating expenses, right? And so like what this practically looks like is I remember being in a space like this, not this, actually this is a cool space, a much less cool space. And somebody, and it was like a Latinx run fund, and they were doing these loans for undocumented folks to get DACA, apply for DACA status. And the loan, the interest rate was 28%. 28% for $500. And the reason for it was that their cheapest loans, I think, were like 6%, right, to things that felt less risky. And then, but this felt so risky. Like, we don't know how we're gonna get this money back, and so the way that we're gonna get the money back is to charge a bunch of interest, so that if, 3/4 of them fail, we have this money over here that makes up for that failure. So, and that's a ridiculous example, but it's a real example that actually happens a lot. And so part of what we're trying to figure out too is like, what mechanisms do we need to do to cover that like perceived risk? Because we're not gonna put that risk on an entity that's already been extracted from, that's already been disinvested from, and that's already putting in 99.9% of the risk. So, and I share that diatribe just to share that like, we're working towards countering a narrative in this country that things are working well. And like, we all know here that they're not, but that is a narrative, and I can't think of a space that I've kind of been in more than in finance, where that narrative feels like really cemented.
But until there's a shift, and literally an intentional shift in the way decisions are made around the allocation of resources to the CDFI industry, that they start building organizations and start building communities and really making investments, intentional investment in black and brown CDFIs, then we're gonna have this conversation 64 years from now about the same things, because nobody is really looking in the mirror and saying, look, I'm beyond the shame of George Floyd, and those conscious dollars are no longer here, and we're back to business as usual. And if we allow that to happen, shame on us.
It definitely seems to me like there's the conventional finance system, and there's alternatives here that we're talking about. And Mariela, you're mentioning some ways of kind of operationalizing the need that racial inequity justice have in terms of lending and how funds and CDFIs can operate differently. And I know, Nicole, we've talked about the work that Inclusive Action is doing around character-based lending. And I'm sure, Linwood, you have some examples too. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how do you operationalize that when you get to the actual work of creating loans in communities? What does that look like?
Well, again, we always say the premise is that black-led CDFIs, most of them live in the community. They know the community. They go to church, they eat, right? And they know the people. And they try to meet them where they are. They coined the term personal banker before personal banker became recognized. And that they took the time not just to make a loan, but to help that person prepare, right? And although they had, and it was not the credit score that you had to meet, it was some other things. And we coach you, right? So it's been that one-on-one, it's been that the development, taking the time, given the fact that the money they got, the cost of funds they have, the latitude and the risk, that they were sort of boxed in about the amount of risk. I know one of the things that folks used to hate about me because I was a risk taker, right? And because in order to change some of this stuff, you're going to have to take some risk. And most of the time when you take that risk, people, honorable people, will do the right thing because you help them realize a dream they have. And so it's going to take, I think, meeting people where they are to try to change this system that is based upon a credit box and a financial thoughts that's just not working in black and brown communities.
I get excited talking about operationalization.
Really?
Maybe I'm a bit nerdy in that. But I mean, the devil is in the details, right? And so, I mean, I could go on and on about every detail of our operations that centers the people we serve. But it starts with hiring and our staff from the community, you know, who understand the lived experience, who make our clients feel comfortable, which is one of our criteria. And then it goes into the creation of each loan product. So right now, our latest loan product is an alternative to predatory loans, which is critical in our communities. That was created and designed for that very niche need that is really destroying our communities. You know, down to the other basic details of what does that product look like, what percentage, so on, the length of term, and so on. Something else unique, I think, to us is that we pair every single loan with business coaching or technical assistance for the entire term of the loan product. And again, the way that the business coaching is designed is designed by those from community for community. So those are just some of the ways.
And I just have something to add, because I know there's quite a few of you sitting in one of the most powerful universities in North America. So for those of you who come from BIPOC communities who are going to end up in these CDFI organizations or maybe running them, your job is to look and tear that system down to give access to everyone. Do not become part of the problem. Because we have so many people getting into these institutions and who lose themselves in spaces like Duke, like UNC, even NCCU, and you forget who you come from and who you are and how accountable you're supposed to be to your community. And it's very different when the organization was created from your people, around your people, centering your people, versus you being brought into a white institution to run it because they need you as a check off the box. Look very closely and make a decision whether that is for you or whether it's not, because I can guarantee you the price will be high, extremely high. You will have to become almost a traitor to your own community and your people. Because one thing I'm very sure of is this system has not lasted this long and extracted so much and taken so many lives without thought, simply because it wasn't working for those in power. So I just wanted to say that right quick.
Yeah, I'll just add some context for the EFOD fund, and I'll share that like we're still working on this, right? Like what is it, coming back to the fact that we're trying to change process as part of that. I'll share just like 2 stories. Like I think a lot about process just because of like my own work, right? And seeing, if anything, I think the thing that I always stick to is like the emotional response and like trauma that comes from another bad interaction with money. And I've seen it, I've felt it for myself. I've also like seen it as somebody who was in micro-lending space. I've just seen it. So I think a lot, because we've all felt it, I think we have been very intentional about talking about the nuances of process. So, it's not perfect and we're still working it out, but I'll share some of kind of conceptually what we're doing. One is that we're entering the conversation, as I said, around what will support sustainability in community rather than what supports and maintains wealth, right? Which immediately opens up all this opportunity to think about kind of underwriting or vetting a project differently, right? If you're not always worried about like a capital preservation, then you can think about what actually preserves these projects, these businesses, this land in communities' hands. And so process-wise, what that looked like is that our first kind of vetting mechanism is like, do these things fit into our EFOD criteria, right? That we as practitioners spend a lot of time on and that we feel like the framework works, right? That it's reflective of our work. So our first thing is really like qualitative and understanding of like, does it fit the criteria? We also look a lot around like longevity and community, representation of community, like is it community owned in the end? Which also for us feels like it's another measure of sustainability and impact. And then kind of the last piece is the financial piece. And in that process, we're in the middle of a pilot right now. It's really like partially it's translating, right? It's translating the knowledge that folks might already have. So like they might know their sales, they might like generally know their costs, but breaking it down in a way that makes sense so that we're all on the same page and having conversations around what kind of debt they feel like they can take. Because I think like we underestimate the capacity and knowledge of folks of understanding in that space, like once you have kind of demystified the financial piece. So process-wise, like I would say that it's a shift to more qualitative pieces that make sense within the EFOD framework without totally displacing the financial piece, but the financial piece is like second to it, right? And then I think another piece about process, as I shared, is that we are really trying to bridge this idea that like everything is just market-based, right? So we're also having conversations of, hey, like what kind of grant support do you need and what kind of investment, like, debt vehicle actually makes sense to you. And then again, the technical assistance piece, I'll share this as well because I love stories that are crappy that have put me in this space, but in this $100,000 loan I was sharing with y'all, one of the other loans that we were also working on was $1 million one for a space. And that space, just to share, came out of like a 20-year community project. Like the plan came out of a 20-year community-led project. And when we went to the lender, who PS is the same lender you're talking about, Cameron, that we're not naming here, they were like, well, how do you know? Like, how do you know that people need this? And we're like, because there's been 20 years of community planning. Right. And they're like, you know what? We really need a market study. And here's this consultant. It's going to cost you $75,000. It's going to be information that will be 0% useful to your project, but it will make us feel better. So we were like, dang, okay. So instead of using those resources for like a million other things, this was the only loan that was available to us at the time. We invested $75,000 in a market study that told us nothing that was useful. In fact, it said, this community is like poor, black, and brown. Cool, thanks. And then, so we're like, great, we did this market study, and they're like, how do you know this will be successful? And we're like, okay, well, because these entities that are going to be part of this space, a grocery store, a Black-led community clinic, this distribution company have been around and making it happen for anywhere from 50 years to 10 years on the shortest. Like, that's how we know. They're like, you know what? You really need a feasibility study. So that's another 50 grand of like random strangers who come into our store, come into the pharmacy, come into whatever. So we spent $125,000. We didn't even we closed on the loan. We ended up not doing the project, but $125,000 on stuff that was literally useless. It was documents that we got that we paid to consultants that were white, that were in academia, and sat on a shelf or went into a Dropbox folder, right? So thinking about the technical assistance that folks have shared here around like really meeting people where they're at, it's also finding practitioners who understand our work and like can actually support things that are useful to us, right? So like that might not be a market study, it might be like how to use a land tealing tool.
That's right.
Well.
That's right.
And so I think that's another piece just process-wise, and I'll share that like we're still trying to figure this out. Like this network that exists around technical assistance is the network that you probably envision. So really trying to build a network of folks that understand our context and that like look like us is an undertaking in itself.
Good stuff.
It really is, and I feel like what we've all been talking about is really bridging that gap between community-based knowledge and power and wealth, and making sure that that power and wealth is directed and that there are spaces for power and wealth in our communities.